You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 19th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Who will be sitting down when the music stops at the EU's top table? Are the French and the British fed up with their governments for different reasons? And why you'd better be on time to meet the President of Bulgaria? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Quentin Peel and Nina Dos Santos will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the former civil servant who had to implement Margaret Thatcher's ideas about reorienting the British economy in 1979. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Quentin Peel, Associate Fellow with the Europe Programme at Chatham House, and by Nina Dos Santos, International Broadcast Correspondent and former CNN Europe Editor. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Greetings.
Quentin, first of all, we will shortly be turning to the subject of the European elections, recent they were, and matters arising. You have been agog covering them, haven't you? You are part of what is now an even more dwindling minority of British people who care about EU elections.
I fear so. It has always been a fascination of mine because I find it actually an extraordinary moment to somehow read the temperature of an entire continent, but it's quite difficult to interpret, and I got so distracted trying to write about it that I forgot half the other things I was supposed to be doing during the week.
I think you may be the single person in these islands most absorbed by the EU elections, apart possibly from Nina. You went to Brussels.
To cover it, indeed, and I found myself very much as a British journalist in the minority. I could only, full disclosure, I was there to be a guest on a BBC show. That was the only big broadcaster I saw that was British, that was in any, there in any big capacity. I came across maybe one or two Brussels-based journalists for big, reputable UK news organisations.
They must feel like those Japanese soldiers who fought World War II until 1974 at this point.
Quite, indeed. Or somebody manning the border between India and China, for instance, one of the longest-running conflicts.
Well, shame on you all, because I still think they matter.
Well, we will start with the shakeout from those elections, and the early betting did seem to be that European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen would get to keep her job. But this has not been as straightforward a proposition as had been anticipated. Though she is probably likelier than not to get another go-round, there has been no formal agreement on her renewal, nor on a clutch of other top jobs, including EU Foreign Policy Chief, European Council Head or European Parliament President. Quentin, first of all, let's look at the top job. Is there really any doubt about von der Leyen?
Not a lot, but I think they've got to show a little bit more sensitivity about how they get their act together. And I think the problem seems to have been, as much as anything, that they didn't include Giorgia Meloni from Italy, who is, of course, in one of the far-right groups in the European Parliament. And this was in the sort of pre-dinner stitch-up. So it was France and Germany, i.e. President Macron and Chancellor Scholz, who sort of convened it all. And she was so fed up because she came top of the poll in her election, whereas both Scholz and Macron did really rather badly in their respective elections.
Well, yes, we will be talking later in the show about the possible consequences of Macron's faction doing badly in those elections. But Nina, if we look at the bookies' favourites for the other top jobs, by far the most eye-catching one is the idea of Kaja Kallas, Estonia's Prime Minister, as the EU's new foreign policy chief. Now, over and above her capacities, which are considerable, as anybody who has heard her speak will recognise, that would be quite a statement in the direction of Moscow, wouldn't it? An Estonian is now running foreign policy for the European Union.
And an Estonian who's repeatedly warned that in a few years' time, about 3 years' time, according to the Baltic states' reckoning, they believe that Russia could breach NATO borders. So yes, she would be that type of leader, and probably because of or foreign policy chief, because remember, she was also snubbed for the role at NATO. This is the other big thing, partly because of these types of sort of statements that are viewed as quite sort of aggressive, and as a result, what we now know as of yesterday evening is that Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, has managed to secure that role, overcoming the resistance of countries like Hungary by giving them a little bit of wiggle room on certain policies.
What do you make of the idea of Kaja Kallas? Because, again, as Nina correctly points out, one of the reasons that people... there seem to be two things doing the rounds about why she would be an unsuitable NATO Secretary-General. One is that she does lead an extremely small country, though that does not appear, of course, to have prevented Mark Rutte. The other is that it would be seen as somewhat inflammatory, given the country she is from, and, as Nina also points out, a great many of the things she said about Russia.
Well, I think that would be part of the statement that the European Union would be making, that indeed she has taken a very clear line of warning against Russian aggression. She is a very articulate and highly intelligent, very attractive candidate. And so I think, and she's a liberal. And of course, in the divvy up of jobs in the European Union, traditionally, the Conservatives get one, the Socialists get one, and the Liberals get one. So she fits the bill. I think she'll have to do a lot of very fast learning on the other most difficult issue, which is, of course, Israel and Gaza, because that's going to be a huge part of the agenda for any foreign policy chief in Europe.
Nina, on the divvying up of the top jobs, where then, if we think maybe Kaja Kallas is being lined up as High Representative, do we think that fits in with the other ones or ideas doing the rounds, which are Roberto Metsola to stay on as President of the Parliament and Antonio Costa, former President of Portugal, to become European Council head?
Well, the person whose position is looking shakiest of all is obviously Antonio Costa, the former Portuguese Prime Minister. As a socialist, he was supposed to be that candidate that was going to be given to that side of the political spectrum. But it appears as though where this so-called stitch-up has sort of gone awry yesterday evening, or the evening before, I forget now because so much has happened in European politics this week, is that the European People's Party, which is the centre-right bloc that came out triumphant in these European parliamentary elections, appears to have gotten a bit greedy and demanded not just 2 out of the 4 jobs, but potentially a chunk of the third one, which is the European Council presidency. So at some point they would occupy 3 out of the 4 jobs, and as a result, that's part of what's blocked Ursula von der Leyen's, candidacy at this point. But we should manage expectations to point out that we still wouldn't have an official candidacy confirmed confirmation of Ursula von der Leyen before the 27th of June, when you get the formal European Council meeting. This was just an informal one to tee things up before the rubber stamping.
Quentin, just before we move off this, there was before the elections, of course, an amount of doom, gloom, rending of garments, clanging of bells, etc., about a anticipated surge of the far right. And they did not have a bad evening of it, I think it's fair to say. But do you anticipate, when you look at the makeup of the new parliament, that much will actually change as a result?
Well, arithmetically, it isn't too dramatic, but actually in terms of mood and in terms of sort of the way the parliament works, the parliament is... in its nature, it makes compromises. And in their nature, the far right and indeed the far left do not make compromises. And so they're very difficult people to work with in that situation. And the other side of the far right is essentially they're all nationalists. So as nationalists, they don't tend to get their act together in European ways. So they've got 2 things going for it, or going against them. One is that they don't seem to be able to actually agree with each other and therefore get more influence. On the other hand, they do have now maybe 160 members of the parliament broadly defined as far right, which is not a huge amount short of the EPP group as the largest group in the parliament, the centre right. But as a whole, the parliament is much more conservative than it was.
Well, let's move along on, I guess, a thematically similar subject. And we are now 11 days away from a French parliamentary election, or at least the first first round thereof, and 15 from a British parliamentary election. Both have been called earlier than was strictly necessary by party leaders risking a kicking. The key difference between French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is that Macron will get to keep his job and may bluff the French electorate into staying on side, whereas Sunak at this point would be more prudently spending his time packing than campaigning. Nina, let's look at Macron first because it is the less foregone conclusion here. Do you think, as someone who knows France pretty well, that his big bluff will work?
It's not looking promising, is it? You look at some of the polls that have been conducted over the last few days, and it looks as though his party is currently in third position at this point. It looks as though the National Rally, they might not get a majority. And the big issue is that Jordan Bardella has now taken to the airwaves overnight and said, I don't want the premiership if I'm not going to get a majority, which essentially calls Emmanuel Macron's bluff. I don't know where that leaves us. But the leftist alliance there, that group that also includes the far left, could get 25% of the vote and leave Macron in third position between 18 and 20%. So it's not looking promising for him. And also the other issue is that it doesn't appear as though he's actually shared any of his thinking with his own inner cabinet or many of his own MPs as well. So that depicts him as a very sort of grandiose president who we know, since he lost his majority in 2022, thanks to the rise of the far right, likes to rule by decree. And it just comes across as though he's becoming more and more detached, more and more beholden to his cause célèbre on foreign policy and not really listening to the French population on domestic issues.
Quentin, I obviously have considerable authority on this matter myself, having been within the last few days ignored from quite a close distance by President Macron. This was at the Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland, where he kept a press gaggle waiting for 45 minutes and then strolled breezily past us. He did give us a wave, in fairness. So what I glean from that, Quentin, he said, bluffing furiously, is that maybe Macron saw this idea as a win-win. He thinks, OK, optimal result is the French people don't call my bluff. They do back away. They do vote for relatively sensible options. Or even if they do elect the yahoos, fine. Let these clowns govern for 3 years and then let's talk about this at the presidential election and see how well you think this is working.
I have a nasty feeling that actually he may have thought that, and I think it's a very rash thought, that actually he might have a prime minister from the National Rally, the far right, i.e. this man Jordan Bardella, who is mainly got there, as far as I can see, because he's all over TikTok rather than anything more substantial. But nonetheless, it's a huge risk. I mean, the year 1933 sort of comes back to one's memory, where a president put a far-right person in power in Germany, thinking that will curb them, that will make them, get real about government.
Did that not work out well?
Apparently not. So I think it's an extraordinary risk that he's been taking. And after all, what the European elections, which is not always a very good sounding board for national elections, because people tend to protest in the European elections, precisely because they don't think they're terribly important. Having said that, the National Rally was pretty much the top party almost all over the country, and also got a much wider constituency for the young, the old and everybody else than they had in the past. So the momentum is with them.
Just before we talk about the British election, Nina, one more thought on Macron. Might his thinking also have been coloured by the fact that, and I know this is a very, very low bar, but for somebody quite a long way into being president of France, he's not hated nearly as much as most of his predecessors. Usually at this point, even if you get into a second term, usually at this point, the angry mobs with pitchforks are camped outside the gates.
Yeah, we all remember the days of François Hollande where he plunged many double digits, didn't he, just within a couple of years.
I am literally more popular in France than François Hollande is.
Oh, well, they don't know you. No, but well, I don't think they know Emmanuel Macron that well either, because, all French presidents, as we know, they're highly intelligent and very well-educated beings. They're obviously strategists, and what we can think assumes that Macron's got some big strategy. It's just he's not imparting it with his cabinet or anybody else. But that doesn't really help if, you're in a country where people want some kind of contact with their leader and so on and so forth. He's also presided over an era where France's influence in the world is declining, just at a time when he's focusing on talking about foreign policy so much. In fact, I was just watching an interview that Jordan Bardella gave to a gaggle of TV reporters earlier this morning, and he immediately went on the attack to talk about this issue that Macron's floated about sending special forces, quote unquote, over to Ukraine. And he said, we don't want French forces in Ukraine. Nobody wants that. Even Ukraine doesn't want that. So they're sort of fomenting this concern about, overzealous foreign policy from Macron, ignoring the domestic issues that French people are facing. I don't know. I think the biggest bet is that he's probably doing exactly what you were both saying before. He's saying, well, if you want, I've only got 2-3 years left in my presidency. If you want to try a far-right government, then go ahead, vote for it. If you keep criticising me for having been too imperious with my style of presidency.
I mean, the seamless links are coming thick and fast on today's show, Quentin, and on the subject of party leaders who called early elections without necessarily consulting their cabinet or thinking it all the way through. Do you yet have any idea, and I was thinking about this again today when there has actually been some pretty positive economic news here in the United Kingdom, inflation down again to about 2%, which is, credit where due, an astonishing recovery from the double digits it was at not so long ago. This is obviously happening far too late for it to make the least bit of difference to what's going to happen on July the 4th. Do you have any idea why Sunak went early?
I think he might have just been getting fed up with being Prime Minister and everybody beating him up and saying, well, let's get on with it and get off to California for a summer holiday. I mean, or somebody else has got it in for him and they want to blame him. I mean, we are going to see a meltdown of the Conservative Party like none of us have known in our lifetimes. It's quite extraordinary how the party is going to be reduced to a shadow of itself. I saw rather an interesting interview that's just been done with Kim Campbell, who was leader of the Conservative Party in Canada, when they went into meltdown, and how psychologically one can survive that. But it is an extraordinary situation where the party is not going to be anything like the party that we remember. And I think it'll take at least a decade for them to start getting their act back together again.
Nina, there are obviously polls you can read if you want to immerse yourself in the absolutely giddy ideas of a complete apocalypse. There are some polls suggesting that the Tories might even be struggling to come second, that they may not even be His Majesty's loyal opposition anymore.
There were just one or two, though.
That's just one or two, and I'm not buying it myself, richly amusing though it would be. But how big a meltdown are you anticipating?
Oh, gosh. I mean, I'm not a single poll. There have been many people who've been
held to this.
Paid lots of money and done huge sample sizes. The last most significant poll actually was just published overnight, and I think that predicted Labour was going to get a supermajority of something like 256, which would mean they've got over 453 seats, I think, to the Conservatives' 111. But what's more interesting is also the fact that Nigel Farage is now claiming, with these polls predicting he might just get between 1 seat for himself or maybe maximum 7, one other poll predicts.
I'll take that bet.
He says that he's the official opposition, and I think what they're trying to do is, just as Quentin was saying before, recreate Canada a la 1993, where you had this implosion of the Conservative Party, where I think they eventually only got 2 seats in the end, and Reform in Canada might have gotten something like 40, and they engineered a reverse takeover of the Conservative Party in Canada. And knowing Nigel Farage personally, lots of us have interviewed him as journalists because he always used to make himself accessible, by the way, when he was in Brussels. No more of that these days. But he, I think he's probably studying that model very, very astutely, and that's what he's trying to create.
Well, let's now compare and contrast all of that with two leaders who are serenely unbothered by the rough and tumble of democratic politics. Russian President Vladimir Putin, possibly in search of a setting in which he seems like the reasonable guy, is visiting North Korea, where in between grimacing at platoons of terrified children waving flags, he has concluded some species of mutual defence accord with his roly-poly counterpart, North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un. In adjacent news, the European Court of Human Rights has come down against Russia's law targeting foreign-funded organisations. Rap on the knuckles there, Quentin, from the ECHR. Will Putin now see the error of his ways?
I fear not, no.
I
fear that he will
answer.
blithely ignore what is a moral victory for his opponents in the European Court of Human Rights, but not, I fear, one that will have a dramatic effect in the real world. I mean, it's extraordinary to watch him schmoozing in North Korea with Kim Jong-un, who, after all, appears to most of us as a bit of a sort of joke figure almost, and yet he's like an imaginary sort of far-right dictator. But he isn't, of course. He's a far-right dictator who is trying to get nuclear weapons. And for Putin to go down there and virtually encourage him in that ambition just seems to be, well, it's deeply alarming, because it shows that Putin doesn't care any longer about anything except, in the end of the day, his victory in Ukraine.
Now, Nina, I was thinking about this earlier and wondering, is there any chance, do we think, that Putin recognises what a diminished and faintly ridiculous figure he has become? Because his previous visit to North Korea was in 2000. He had just become president of Russia. He was actually regarded by many serious people with some optimism that this was the future of a pragmatic, practical, sensible, reborn Russia we could all do business with. He dropped in on North Korea on his way to the G8 in Okinawa, which was the kind of thing Russia used to get invited to back then. And now he's kind of effectively panhandling for artillery.
Yes, you've got this sort of axis of autocracy and axis of all these sort of rogue states coalescing, don't you? And then more loosely aligned, you've also got trading partners from the global south that I think Putin's also trying to, make sure that he can do more trade with. Now, obviously, something, pariah state like North Korea, as Quentin was just saying before, is sort of the ultimate, it's the height of almost dark comedy that he actually goes physically there as well and spends so much time there. But it's important because I was reading that the United States say that, I think, according to their research, something like 11,000 containers of military munitions from North Korea have actually made their way into Ukraine to help Russia with its war effort. And obviously North Korea wants access to, and some of that can include missiles. It gives North Korea the opportunity to test its missiles in a hot war zone, and then they can with Russian armaments and money, if they can get any, replenish their stocks. They can get food and oil from Russia, and also vital space equipment for satellites, and potentially help with submarines to launch missiles, engage in nuclear testing from under the sea as well, which would massively ramp up North Korea's capability. And I think it's for this reason that the White House says they're particularly worried and watching this developing, blossoming friendship between Putin and Kim Jong-un.
Quentin, another place from which this blossoming friendship will be being keenly regarded is Beijing. How delighted do you think China is by this? I would
have thought that this must worry the Chinese a bit, because although they have kept North Korea a little bit on side under their umbrella, they've also been a restraining factor, I think, on Kim Jong-un. And to see him, in a way, lauded and blown up as a hero by Putin should worry them. But the trouble is with China, throughout this whole Ukraine experience, we've thought they would act as more of a restraining force on Putin and on Russia than they have. They've not actually, and I fear that at the end of the day, their calculations are entirely what will embarrass the Americans most. That is still fundamental to China.
Well, let's look at diplomacy. Well, sort of democracy, but diplomacy at a much more micro level, because whatever other criticisms may legitimately be made of Bulgarian President Rumen Radev, he cannot be accused of a lackadaisical attitude to timekeeping. On a visit to Montenegro this week, he bailed on a meeting with Montenegrin Prime Minister Monocle Daily after waiting 4 minutes beyond the appointed time. The PM's people attempted to explain that a previous meeting had run over by 3 minutes, but to little avail. Harumphed a spokesman for President Radev, it is completely natural for the head of state to refuse a meeting for which the host is not ready. So there, he didn't say, but clearly meant. Nina, has President Radev, do you think, been somewhat impatient?
Sounds like it, doesn't it? Although we did have a situation here in the UK, didn't we, where Kyriakos Mitsotakis of Greece came all the way over here and didn't manage to meet our Prime Minister, although there was something going on in the background there which involved some very valuable and emotive old marbles from the Parthenon. But so there are precedents of this type of thing, but it does seem rather sort of petty, given the stakes in the Western Balkans and given the fact that Montenegro is a rather new country, new member of NATO, but both of these two countries recently had formed governments, didn't they? And Bulgaria just got its own government the other day.
I mean, it is, as Nina intimates, Quentin, a combustible part of the world, famously. Do we see the first exchange of a third Balkan war here?
No, I don't think we do. But I do think that in spite of the fact the Bulgarian president appears to have said, we do back the ambitions of Montenegro to join the European Union, I don't think they're very happy with that at all. Like Greece, they've got their eyes on Montenegro as well. The two, poor little Montenegro, I'm not sure that it is poor little Montenegro, but is sort of caught between Greece and Bulgaria, neither of whom really likes to encourage its existence and development in the world.
I did want to ask you both, you must have experience of being kept waiting by politicians. I, for example, have my own recent experience of being kept waiting for 45 minutes by President Macron, only for him to turn up, give us all a big wave and keep strolling. For perspective, Nina, I have twice interviewed Bulgaria's former Prime Minister, Nikolai Denkov, who I remember as being absolutely on the dot at the appointed time. I don't think... have you had any particular bad experiences with being kept waiting? You must have.
I was once at a press conference, I can say this now because, bless him, he's no longer with us. Silvio Berlusconi was famous for this type of thing. I do remember once Michel Barnier, when I think he was the French foreign minister, flying over to a summit I had to go to in Turin when I was a correspondent in Italy. He'd just been sorting out the situation, and he said, I'd just come from Rwanda, or it was Ivory Coast or somewhere where there was something terrible happening, and he made it on time, and Berlusconi was 45 minutes late. And the first thing they had to do when they sat down at the press conference was spray Berlusconi's hair on before we started. So I in front of the full waiting press crowd. So yeah, I've only really seen it with Berlusconi before, but I was having a look at other leaders who are kept waiting, famously by Vladimir Putin, who is famous for this.
He does this a lot.
And that chart really tells you where you are in the diplomatic order. I noticed that Angela Merkel was 4 minutes 15. He made her wait once. Barack Obama was one of the ones who only had to wait half an hour, but Queen Elizabeth fared better than anybody else at 14 minutes max.
It is the deliberate lateness thing. It is a basic jackass power move, Quentin, and you must have run up against it more than once.
Yes, not keeping me waiting particularly, but to be honest, keeping all the other heads of government waiting. The one who was notorious for it was François Mitterrand, who always liked to be the last to arrive. And I think it was a G8 summit in Munich, the first one to which they ever invited Russia in the form of Boris Yeltsin. And Mitterrand was determined to be the last, and he failed. And I'm trying to remember who was even later than him. I think it was the Canadian Prime Minister. Anyway, Mitterrand was absolutely furious. I imagine all the other people around the table found it very funny because he had to actually not be the one to get the great entry.
See, I came up through journalism originally as a rock journalist, and that involved, Nina, interacting with many people whose timekeeping was... Well, they took a very sort of rock star attitude to timekeeping. I think my record was waiting the thick end of 2 days to be granted an audience with Pearl Jam. But since someone else was paying for me to stay in the Four Seasons in Seattle, didn't mind so much. And it turned out, to be clear, it wasn't actually Pearl Jam's fault. They are genuinely nice chaps. But if you have an interview lined up, Nina, with like a proper potentate, do you have a cut-off point? Do you just think I'm sitting here until I'm told otherwise? Or would you reach a point of thinking, I don't care who they are, screw this, I'm off?
I've never yet been in that situation. I might I must add. Although it does help if you do live television. You can tell them that, you're about to go on air, come what may. And then, funnily enough, that seems to accelerate things quite a bit.
Do you want to be on television or not want to be on television?
Yes, quite. Well, you can also cut them off, or if they think you're in a commercial break and they, protest too much, you can pretend you're on air again, which really helps to keep people on message. No, thankfully, I think people have gotten, things have gotten a bit more stage managed nowadays, that I would say is for sure. But look, US presidents as well, their press conferences are famous for keeping people waiting.
I think they can. Again, thinking back to the NATO summit last summer, and I didn't take it personally because this happened to literally everybody who happened to be trying to get anywhere when Joe Biden decided he wanted to move 10 metres in any given direction, and they basically closed the entire city. So there were a couple of instances of people sitting on shuttle buses, missing their flights because someone somewhere had heard that the motorcade was revving up. Quentin, I'll put the same question to you in closing. Do you have a cut-off point? Have you ever sat there waiting for some panjandrum to turn up and just thought, you know what, I've finished my book, I'm bored, I'm cold, to hell with them, I'm going?
I think possibly in Nigeria, when I've sat for maybe as much as an hour and a half, 2 hours in the minister's waiting room, and then finally you get those immortal words, "Oh, the minister done travel." And you suddenly realise that you've been completely screwed. So I think I had a rule of about 1 hour maximum, and then I'm off.
I've said before, we'll say again, any up-and-coming journalists listening, and I realise technology has moved on, but batteries can fade. Always, always have a big book in your bag. Nina Dos Santos and Quentin Peel, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the general election in the UK is holding 2 weeks tomorrow, shapes as one of the more consequential in recent decades, and possibly pivoting gracefully to the next item, as significant a change in direction as that of 1979, when Labour was unloaded by a Conservative Party led by Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher, a devotee of the creed of monetarism, set about rebuilding the UK's economy according to the precepts of her preferred dogma. In charge of actually implementing this was her private secretary for economic affairs, the economist and civil servant Sir Tim Lancaster. Sir Tim reflects on that period in a new book called Thatcher's Monetarism Experiment, The Promise, the Failure, the Legacy. I spoke to Sir Tim earlier at Midori House. I began by asking him what was different about the approach Margaret Thatcher wanted to take upon reaching Downing Street in 1979.
I was Jim Callaghan's private secretary in the winter of discontent, 78-79, and then the Callaghan government was defeated. Mr Thatcher came in on May the 3rd, and it was very different. The Callaghan economic policy had been based on incomes policy, agreement with the trade unions as to what was achievable in terms of wage increases, and that was his way of trying to control inflation. But that all blew up through multiple strikes during the winter of 78-79. Mrs Thatcher arrived with a completely different approach. She didn't believe in incomes policies, and she believed that inflation, which was her top priority, could be controlled by curbing the growth of the money supply. It didn't work out well, as my book explains.
This is, of course, the creed that became known as monetarism, which at the time, as I understand it, was actually regarded as a somewhat eccentric, even obscurant pursuit. Why had she lit upon it?
Well, she thought it was common sense. And in a sense, it is common sense that if you have more money chasing the same volume of goods, then prices are going to go up. And historically, that is the case. There is a historical link between money supply, however you define it, and prices. But Milton Friedman, who promoted this policy of monetarism, he believed that because there was this historic link, that meant, logically, if you control the money supply in the short term, that would control inflation. In practice, if you look carefully at his data, as many economists did, they showed that there was an unstable relationship between money and prices in the short term. But she and her inner circle were undeterred by these criticisms, even though criticisms came from most of the great economists of the period, including James Mead at Cambridge, Paul Samuelson at MIT, James Tobin at Yale. She put these on one side. And one of the reasons was that the policies of the time in the 70s hadn't gone well. Unemployment had been rising, inflation had been rising, and so there was an appetite for doing something new. And she believed that adopting monetarism was the way to go. But she didn't look or listen carefully to the contrarian views, which were many.
I mean, obviously in the role you occupied at the time, it was your job to implement government policy, but nevertheless, did you or other civil servants try to point out, well, there are contradictions, there are objections to this, the proverbial, are you sure that's wise, Prime Minister?
Well, we did, but probably not quite as strongly as we might have done. One of the reasons for that was it was very explicit in the Conservative Party's manifesto of 1979 that monetarism was going to be the way they were going to run the policy. And there was a long convention in the civil service, which continues to this day, that if something is set out firmly in a manifesto, it's the civil servant's job to do what they can to help implement it. So yes, the criticisms were pointed out to them, but I have to say, partly because the previous policies hadn't been working well. The 1970s was a bad decade for the... there was a sort of feeling that, yes, well, the civil service had better go along with what was proposed.
Is there a straightforward to explain the damage that was done by this? Because I know that it's often advanced as a creed of, well, any kind of sudden economic reform, that there will be short-term pain, but there will be long-term gain. Do you still think that the gain was not worth the pain, as it were?
Well, I wouldn't put it quite like that. There had to be some pain, because inflation was on the rise. And in the absence of incomes policy to try to get agreement on wage increases, there had to be a deflation of the economy. There had to be increasing unemployment, which would put downward pressure on wages. But what went wrong was that the deflation was excessive, and that happened because the money supply figures, the money figures were actually quite misleading. The money supply was going up 17-18%. So on the Friedman theory of monetarism, that suggested that monetary policy was very loose and that money supply needed to be pulled back. But actually, monetary conditions, all you had to do was look out of the window if you lived north of Birmingham. Monetary conditions were very, very tight. And yet, for a while, the government went on trying to do its best to bring the money supply down. And that did cause a deflation that was in excess of what was necessary. So basically, a deflation was necessary in order to curb inflation. But the doctrine of monetarism, as it's applied, led to deflation, which was unduly sharp. And that resulted in more unemployment, in my view, than was necessary. Our unemployment rose from 1.4 million during 1979 to over 3 million in 1983-84. And while part of that was necessary and would have happened anyway, because there was a world recession, but the downward pressure on demand through higher interest rates went to 17%.
Indeed.
That was the Bank of England's base rate. And there was a famous or infamous budget in 1981, which at a time when the economy was still in recession, which put further downward pressure on demand. And although the economy did begin to recover in late 1981, the recovery was more anemic than it need have been. And so we had higher unemployment. Inflation did come down, but it wasn't because of control of the money supply. Indeed, the money supply exceeded its targets in each of the first 5 years.
Does it strike you that successive Conservative governments have entirely detached themselves from Friedman's ideas or variations on monetarism? Do you see echoes of it, I guess I'm asking, in the austerity of the David Cameron period or Liz Truss's abortive attempt to reform the British economy of, God, was that whenever the hell that was? But
well, I don't think you see it in Liz Truss's so-called growth plan. But where you do see a legacy is in the idea that fiscal policy, that is to say taxes and spending, should not normally be used to stabilise the economy. Only in extreme situations, such as during the great financial crisis in 2008-9 and then during COVID, do you use public spending and tax cuts to stabilise the economy. In normal times, you only use monetary policy, that's interest rates. And that legacy, in a way, was unfortunate because during the so-called austerity years after 2010, when the government, the Treasury, put downward pressure on demand, tried to cut the debt, which I think was unnecessary. So we had a pretty moderate, unnecessarily slow recovery after the global financial crisis. And that was partly a legacy of the idea, which came out of monetarism, that used monetary policy to control the economy.
That was Sir Tim Lancaster, former Private Secretary for Economic Affairs to UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. His book, Inside Thatcher's Monetarism Experiment, is available now. That's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Quentin Peel and Nina Dos Santos. Today's show was produced by Henry Rhys Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.